it's really great to have an invitation from him to speak, because I know that whoever clusters around Felix will always have interesting things to say. But it's a wonderful season, and I'm really delighted to be in such good company as the other speakers, as well as my hosts. So Fieldwork in the Archive, Herbaria as Sites of Cultural Exchange, is a 2-year intensive project investigating the colonial histories and present-day meanings of the Danish National Herbarium. I'm the principal investigator, and I'm lucky to work with really quite eminent co-investigators. Jens Solberg, who is an ethnobotanist with a very deep knowledge of, if I can just see if this works. Yes. Jens Solberg, who's in the foreground, who is an ethnobotanist with a deep knowledge of Black Atlantic medical plants. And Casper Andersen, who's an historian of science with a particular interest in decolonial scientific heritage, mainly in relation to 20th century Africa. And Sina Mellemgaard, who's an anthropologist of 18th century knowledge and sociability in Scandinavia. So that's the team that I'm working with. The wider team that you see on the slide includes some members of our advisory board. I'm going to start with an overview of several of the research questions and contexts for this project. And then I will move on to outline some of our methods and also the challenges of asking humanities research questions of a scientific collection like the herbarium. In the third and final part of my talk, I will outline findings from one of our case studies, which is focused on the Danish West Indies, which is now, of course, the US Virgin Islands. So for starters, I'm going to give you a sort of outline of some of the research questions. Many of them are historical, but there are other research questions that relate to communities in the present day. But essentially, what we want to do is, through the historical research, try to demonstrate the cultural and historical significance of plants and botanical collections, which of course not only have a deep history, and in this context, it's 400 years, but also multiple meanings and values in different cultural contexts. Another aim of the project is to enable collections access, both digital and in person, to interdisciplinary humanities and social science researchers, and also to the descendants of the communities of origin where these collections originate. Finally, we want to engage communities of origin and their descendants with historical natural heritage botanical materials, online and in person, enabling a two-way knowledge exchange that actually honors traditional knowledge, which, as we know, can often be absent from the record. So the historical research questions, there's two sets of them, really. One of them relates to the making of the collections. So it's a case of what are the labor and logistics of colonial natural history, what routes and networks, both literal and figurative, do these botanical materials take in order to get into the museum, and the knowledge also that accompanies or does not accompany them. What are the political, economic, and social contexts and drivers of these trajectories? So mainly they are they have to do with the same questions that are addressed by colonial and global histories, for example. So another question is, who were the actors in these networks, and what were their functions in the movement of these materials from the point of origin into the museum? And of course, at what points along these trajectories of the transfer and movement of both materials and information are bodies of knowledge produced? In what ways and by whom? The second set of questions actually relates to asymmetry in knowledge between communities. and asymmetry between communities to cool. So what counts as information to be noted during the collection of these materials historically, when and why? And what local or traditional information is left out of these knowledge regimes? And that has to do with the creation of knowledge along the trajectory of transference of material from what has perhaps erroneously been called margin to metropole in the past. A further question is what instances or actors have actually benefited from the bodies of knowledge created, and what instances or actors have been disenfranchised by the management of this knowledge? And when I say the management of the knowledge, I also mean how it is organized and, in a collection context, reorganized over time, and to what effect. So in what ways is it historically contingent and conditioned? So, of course, translocation is a key part of the practices that we're studying. And maybe we better take a look at that. So the kind of translocation that we're talking about with regard to herbarium collections could be illustrated in the way that I'm about to do. So here is a biologist who's working in a mangrove ecosystem, studying biomass for the Center for International Forestry Research. This, of course, is a contemporary activity. And here is the kind of place that these sorts of collections end up. This is the United States National Herbarium, which was founded in 1848. It's systematic botany, and it's affected, of course, with dried plant specimens, which is the definition of a herbarium. So what happens here when these materials move from one place to another? A translocation from one context to another. From one complex living natural ecosystem into a complex fixed knowledge system. It goes from being organic to being structured in a knowledge system as the operating principle. We really need to ask ourselves, when working in these kinds of collections that are aggregators, what is involved in this translocation, and what does it mean for an epistemics of the natural world? In fact, all natural history museum collections are complex assemblages of plant and animal biota, minerals and rocks and ores that are translocated from their original environmental habitats and cultural contexts, and then embedded into these kinds of archival, documentary, and classificatory ecosystems that themselves may span hundreds of years, from early modern manuscript notebooks to present-day genomic databases. Over centuries, these cultural assemblages, which are as much networks of people as they are groups of objects, are repeatedly and recursively reconfigured, instrumentalized and transformed through curatorial work, scientific research, and public exhibition interpretation. The trajectories of these materials through space and time almost immediately reveal complex, deep histories of international trade, globalized colonial policies, extractive practices, and the logistics that enable them. Human geographies, contested categories, multiple temporalities across cultures, and hidden agencies of both objects and subjects. This is certainly the case for herbaria across Europe, most of which were formally constituted in contexts of modern exploration, invariably undertaken as expansionist ventures, whether national, missionary, or by privateers, and in the consequent waves of the scientization of this expansionism that unfurled through the Enlightenment period. So Denmark's National Herbarium is no exception. Alongside the Dutch, the English, the French, and the Spanish, what was then Denmark-Norway had extensive trading interests scaffolded on colonial enterprise that included what would come to be known as economic botany by the mid-19th century. In the pantheon of scientific collections in the life sciences, from mammal taxidermy to the pinning of butterflies, few examples more closely resemble documentary archival practice than the convention of the herbarium sheet and its cabinet of shelves. Plant matter, however large or small, is carefully bent and cut to fit on a standard page, with elements of the root, the flower, the stalk, the leaves, the stamen, the pistil, flattened and evident, as if on a living diagram. Data crucial to future botanists is directly affixed to the very same sheet. Capsules of seeds, handwritten information about the date and place of collection, deliberations about nomenclature, indigenous or common names, observations on habitats. Sheets hundreds of years old sport not only Gothic script, but also barcodes that link to genomic particulars and large-scale online databases. The sheets are complex palimpsests, layered of information that demonstrate their own historicity, as each page sends messages forward from one period to another and from one scientific paradigm to another over time. The same details which support taxonomic research also furnish the humanities with clues to the context of natural history collections and their use in the production of knowledge. Each herbarium sheet is annotated directly with a range of data points identifying the name of the collector, location and habitat, and year and season, sometimes an exact date, and later determinations with evolving nomenclature, as we see. Together, they draw a skeleton sketch of people and places and things and changing environments. This is true of several of Herbarium C's significant collections. Those compiled in Pernambuco by Markgrave in 1620. This is Brazil, northeastern Brazil in 1620, when it was occupied by the Dutch. There are also those collected in Greenland by Poul Eede, who was the son of the missionary colonizer Hans Eede. These were collected in 1739. And then Herbarium C also has the collections of Peter Foskol, who was a disciple of Linnaeus, who collected in what is now the Yemen and Egypt from 1761 until his untimely death on the expedition itself in 1763. So it's an astonishingly rich and complex collection. Its very richness and complexity require both wide-reaching and fine-tuned methods if we wish to explore it in any depth. Lorraine Daston's work and methods in relation to studies of the sciences of the archive, those practices of retention and collation of scientific observations over long periods of time, and in relation to, also her work in relation to the practices of objectivity as embodied in typologies and atlases. These two kinds of methods are both robust and precise tools for humanities research in a herbarium. Nonetheless, although the Museum Botanicum Jauniense, as it is known in botanical Latin, may be immensely valuable as an instrument of taxonomic systematics, it also has significance as a case study in the labor and logistics of colonial natural history. Here we can go beyond the unique practices of taxonomic botany and out into the wider political and economic drivers that mesh deeply with the collecting and expeditionary impulse in the early modern and Enlightenment periods which are, of course, concurrent with those of interest to global and colonial historians, charting the naturalization of empire and imperialism. Considerable scholarship on colonial ventures of Denmark, Norway, as well as on Danish expeditionary histories has been affected recently. Both Danmark og kolonierne and Dansk Ekspeditionshistorie offer in-depth understandings of these 18th, 19th, and even 20th century activities. The crossovers and intersections between these two areas of research, expeditions and colonial history, delineate a significant new field of inquiry. In what ways and to what extent is the history of Danish science also the history of Danish colonialism? Tracing the roots and networks, both literal and figurative, through which botanical materials and knowledge came into the Natural History Museum of Denmark over time starts with the sheets themselves and those precise but sparse data points that annotate them. So that's the who, the where, and the when, if you will. They're like actor network diagrams to take these data points and conjoin them in relation to each other. The how involves us looking at correspondence of botanists who are describing intentions and processes and conditions of work, interactions with both locals and colonial powers. The why, the reason to do this kind of work, can usually be found also in archival contexts, state papers identifying commissions and expeditions and instructions to collectors, pay scales, what are people being paid to do this work, project funding, infrastructure, and of course, outcome reporting. Well, there's also the what, and for that we look at taxonomic literature in this project, how global morphological comparison between different species emerges from the centralization of knowledge in colonial collecting from different regions. So the why, those political, economic, and social catalysts and contexts are more likely to be uncovered in correlative colonial archives of the Danish, Africa, Asia, and India companies in the National Archives here, towards which the people and places that are listed on the herbarium sheets are all pointing. So these actors are networks, are actors in networks whose functions actually enable the movement of these botanical materials from the point of origin into the herbarium, into the museum, into the place of taxonomic calculation. These actors are botanists, yes, but they're also plantation owners. They're missionaries, governors, slave ship surgeons, middlemen, cartographers, settlers, miners, and more. All have some degree of access to the infrastructures of the state's adventuring. It is these infrastructures, from capital to communication, from charabancs to cutters, that enable the translocation of vast quantities of plant matter from margin to metropole from the 1500s on. The ways in which such actors and their networks produce bodies of knowledge along the trajectories of the transfer and movement of such material is among our most significant inquiries in fieldwork in the archive. And yet, the herbarium's taxonomic structure itself resists the kind of historiography that the humanities would normally hope to produce. Such a history as I've been describing, of actors, of agencies, of cultures and economies, of technologies, and of ideas. The taxonomic structure of the herbarium relegates to secondary those specimens which do not participate in its typonomenclatural calculus, and with it, the very events of their calculation. Row upon row and rack upon rack, shelf upon shelf of the seemingly endless grid of stacks of sheets, each of which bear dried plants carefully arrayed on a standard rectangle so as to demonstrate its unique morphology. They are shuffled and reshuffled in their cabinets and shelves. The sheets are correlated by species, first and foremost, constantly shifting under contested epistemes, sequential and geographic arrangements, and conceptions of speciation, rewording this riotous plant matter into governable order. The entire scaffolding is like a vast diagram of plant taxonomy created out of the very plants themselves. Of course, all this is hidden from view in the herbarium itself. The smooth cupboard doors are numbered, labeled with curt abbreviations known to botanists, and little indication of what might be lying behind them. Therefore, ascertaining what is actually counted as information to be notated alongside and even directly upon the original collections of herbarium specimens, and what local or traditional information is left out of these knowledge regimes is not always easy. So in practice in the herbarium, this means that any specimen that is not a type specimen, that is not type specimen material, is much, much harder to locate using the name of the collector alone. As outlined above, all is ordered by species in the first instance and by geolocation secondarily. So the names of those collectors who have collected examples for which there already exists a type specimen elsewhere will be lost in a sea of sheets because they are not databased. Only the type specimens are databased. So out of 1.4 million specimens, there's the basic cataloging that exists is 190,000 from the Greenlandic collection, which is a real boon and a blessing to have that material databased, and 25,000 type specimens. So really what I'm saying is that only about 8% of the material is searchable by names or locations or places. Otherwise, you simply have to open a cupboard and take a look. So for example, seeking non-type specimen material collected in the Danish West Indies by even so well-known a Danish botanist as Paul Iselt involves methodically going through hundreds of folders marked South America in all racks holding all species known to have habitats across the Caribbean. Yeah, as you can see, databases are really dwarfed by the scale of the materials themselves. The type specimens can be found in JSTOR plants, which was an initiative of the Paul Mellon Foundation. But what do we do with these other 1.4 million specimens? Even if we have a narrow time frame, we don't have a database that has those date parameters in them. So basically, we devised various methods for sifting physically and intellectually through the collections. Among our methods was to identify what we came to call gateway species. Species of plant that are known to have been of interest during the period from 1750 to 1850. This is really the apex of economic botany as bioprospecting avant la lettre. So economic botany itself is a capacious term that can encompass the many ways in which plants are useful to humans. 20 years ago, the eminent economic botanist Gerald Wickens, who worked for many years at Kew Gardens, defined economic botany as follows. Economic botany is the study of plants, fungi, algae, and bacteria that directly or indirectly, positively or adversely affect man, his livestock, and the maintenance of the environment. The effects may be domestic, commercial, environmental, or purely aesthetic. Their use may belong to the past, the present, or the future. So a few good examples of economic botany would be chocolate from Theobroma cacao, coffee from Coffea arabica, tea from Camellia sinensis, and others include, of course, tobacco, which is Nicotiana tabacum. And perhaps less well known than those, but arguably much more important, both historically and now, would be quinine from the bark of the cinchona tree. Another good example is Gossypium, which is the tree-like shrub that produces cotton. Cotton is, of course, one of the most significant plants in economic botany. Textile products made from cotton are created and worn by people of most cultures and continents on the planet. The qualities of Egyptian cotton or of Indian cotton, or indeed of so-called New World cotton, are extensively discussed by botanists and merchants alike from the very beginning of global trade in the early modern period. With the advent of colonial holdings, European colonists were profoundly interested in what kinds of plants can be transferred from one habitat, one environment, and one continent to another, completely different part of the world, if it would be viable and advantageous. What sort of financial advantages can be had by hybridizing sought-after Indian cotton to grow, let's say, in Danish Caribbean plantations in the 1700s? Well, Danes were very well placed to ask this question, as there were two Danish posts in India, outposts, one at Tranquebar and the other at Salempar, from which Indian cotton was a major import to Europe and her colonies beyond, from the 1600s to the 1800s. In fact, cotton textiles were a pivotal commodity in what was known as the triangle trade across the Atlantic that included enslaved human beings from the west coast of Africa. In this bit of the triangle trade, cotton was literally traded for people from India to Copenhagen, back down the west coast of Africa to what is now Ghana, and on to the Danish West Indies. However, Danes were not only well placed to ask themselves about hybridizing and translocating different species of cotton between their far-flung colonies, they were also well placed to answer this question, because it was not just cotton textiles that were sent back to Copenhagen. It was also cotton plants in the form of specimens and of seeds. Many of the herbarium specimens of Gossypium were either collected in person or exchanged and studied by a man named Julius Philipp Benjamin von Rohr. Von Rohr, who was born in 1737 and died in 1793, was a German-born surveyor and natural historian who was trained in Halle in the orbit of the pietist Fränkische Stiftung. He would have met at an early age a number of natural historians as significant as he was to become himself, who were eventually sent out from the Halle and Danish Halle missions to colonies in India, in Greenland, and in the Danish West Indies. And here I begin the case study that I wanted to share with you that we're working on in fieldwork in the archive. It was not the pietists in the Halle mission that employed von Rohr as a botanist. It was the Danish monarchy. Coming to Denmark to escape the 7 Years' War in 1756, von Rohr petitioned Frederick V early the following year to send him to the Danish West Indies as a land surveyor and natural historian. This job application, which is frankly one of the most beautiful examples of handwriting I've ever seen in many years of archival research, also includes an extraordinary colored drawing of two insects. And I've no doubt that the application itself, as well as the curriculum and training of the applicant, would have played a part in the appointment, which was confirmed very shortly thereafterwards. Von Rohr left Copenhagen for St. Croix in 1757 and was to pass the next 35 years in the Caribbean in the service of the Danish state. His journey, which took the route of the prevailing winds along the triangle route that was then well traveled by Danish slave trade ships, went from Copenhagen down the west coast of Africa before striking westwards towards the Caribbean, an archipelago already completely transformed by plantation economies that would leave deep scars in both the environment and on humanity itself. His travel journal, Von Rohr's travel journal of the voyage, includes a description of St. Croix, which would have followed directly on from the journey, and also an impressive Crucian plant list. His illustration of a cactus is as vibrant and alive as could be today, even 250 years later. Von Rohr's text echoes the better-known and published letters of Poul Isert, whose plant specimens from the West Indies and the Gold Coast of Africa are also held in the Danish National Herbarium. But von Rohr was just as interested in the cultivation of plants as he was in their taxonomy. And with royal support, he established a botanic gardens on the outskirts of Christiansted. Here is a map of its position in 1779. And we can get a bit closer to that. So you can see, if you're joining us from St. Croix, that von Rohr's botanical garden was on Little Hospital Street. So obviously it's the growing of medicinal plants was also a significant activity that he was undertaking, as well as economic botany. In any case, a few years later, von Rohr was given a special commission. Complaints had been made to the Danish Commerce Collegium on the low quality of cotton goods coming from the Danish West Indies. Not the ones coming from India, but the ones that were coming back in the other direction from the Danish West Indies. Von Rohr was asked to travel around the Caribbean and ascertain the reasons for which other European powers' West Indian colonies were able to produce much better cotton fabrics, particularly the Dutch and the French. So here we have an expedition. It's not one going out from the metropole of Copenhagen to its margins and back. It's not even one that tries to be purely scientific. It is botanical and it is economic. It's about plant specimens, but also about propagation, about soil conditions, about practices, and about factories. Based on research by the American scholar Daniel Hopkins, I've been able to reconstruct this journey, assuming that it was made as a round trip during 1783 and 1785. So I've looked at the herbarium sheets and the places that they come from and correlated that with documents that I'll show you later. And Dan Hopkins has also done a similar thing, but not using the herbarium sheets. So this is why it's so great to do interdisciplinary work that's also in some way intergenerational and goes from collection work of the kind that we're doing to the sort of meticulous sort of social and human geography that someone like Dan Hopkins has been doing for decades. So anyway, von Rohr left St. Croix for Guadeloupe and then on to Martinique. From there, he went to Cayenne in French Guiana and stayed quite some time there. Then on to Paramaribo in Suriname before heading for Trinidad and on to Curacao. From Curacao, he went to Colombia and particularly Cartagena and Santa Marta, but also into the mountainous region of Mazinga, which was famed and still is, in fact, famed for tobacco. He then doubled back towards the islands, stopping in Jamaica and Leyte, and he also stopped in Santo Domingo before going on to what is now Puerto Rico, and it's certain that the whole voyage and the research involved more than 2 years. As a result of his research, the Copenhagen Herbarium contains examples of cotton specimens collected in the 1780s from Tranquebar and Cambrai in India, from Thailand, which was then Siam, from St. Thomas, Puerto Rico, Okai, and all the other places that I mentioned that he visited, including South America and Brazil. So he's collected stuff himself, but he's also swapped and traded with other botanists along the way, and also in correspondence. But Van Roer did not only collect specimens and seeds of cotton, he also propagated cotton in his botanical gardens on St. Croix from the time of his return to sometime in 1785. So it was this holistic view, studying the plant morphology, the plant's preferred growing conditions, working with the cultivation and propagation from seed of the cotton shrub that he himself was able to complete, that actually produced what became the first full study of the cotton plant, which Van Roer produced. It was published as a 2-volume treatise on the qualities and cultivation of cotton in the Danish West Indies, published some years later in 1791 for volume 1 and 1793 for volume 2. It is still today considered by botanists to be one of the first and primary sources for taxonomy and propagation of cotton. His reward was another major colonial commission, to follow in the footsteps of Poul Eldman Iselt and to journey to the Danish Gold Coast of Africa to assist in the reorientation of the plantation aspirations of the Danish state after the ban on the slave trade came into force in 1792. Like Iselt, he died in service. The boat that was to take Van Roer, his plant collections, and his books and instruments to Africa was lost at sea. Colonialism is recursive. It comes back again and again. 100 years later, in the 1890s, another Danish botanist, Frederick Buesen, traveled to the Danish West Indies and later published in 1898 the volume On the Vegetation of the Danish West Indies. While there, he took photographs, then a new scientific medium. Among the photographs he took were these images from the Longford cotton plantation and factory on St. Croix. The abolition of slavery itself, as opposed to the slave trade, had been phased in starting in 1847. But here in the 1890s, the islands were still in the limbo time of indenture. So we must ask ourselves, as historians, as collection managers, as curators, whose history is the history of cotton? And how can we come to understand each other through and across plants themselves and their many contexts and meanings? At the end of Lorraine Daston's 2004 article entitled Type Specimens and Scientific Memory, a conjectural coda is introduced, grappling with the inherent and profound contradictions in the botanical nomenclatural code and in its practices of typification, which accommodate both a singular type specimen and a representational aggregate of a typical plant. She turns to the valuable work of Hilary Putnam and Saul Kripke. But the hairlines of natural kinds, which are explored by these philosophers, are still not quite enough. And in a great leap, Daston follows her informed intuition from linguistics to another kind of metaphysics in practice, that of Thomas Hobbes, a great materialist and a great nominalist, but also among the first modern political philosophers. Making an analogy between two metaphors, Daston evokes the Hobbesian vision of the many in the one that adorns the frontispiece of Hobbes's Leviathan in order to demonstrate the representational sleight of hand affected by botanical nomenclaturists. But in so doing, she introduces the very social contract itself into the debate about scientific practice. There's something vertiginous about the proposition, and a deeper level of epistemes bursts forth from the weedy details of botany to which Daston has been attending. The eruption of the political and the social into the botanical is arresting. It cannot be ignored. And among the most evident forms of this entanglement must be the relationships between economic botany and colonial endeavors in the early modern and Enlightenment periods. Thank you.